The biggest lie in this story is not about money. It's about intent. You've been told this was a messy family breakup, complicated, emotional. Everyone is confused. Nobody is malicious. Just misunderstandings layered on top of heartbreak? That framing is wrong. What you are actually watching is a long-running power consolidation, where confusion is not a byproduct, it's a tool. And once you see that, everything that felt chaotic suddenly becomes precise, because none of this works unless one person believes another person is too naive to fight back. That person was Meri.
I need to clarify, Meri wanted all the money from what?
From my house with Meri in Las Vegas. Our house, she wanted all the money from it. That's not how our divorce decree went. It was 50-50. And then she wouldn't recognize all the money that Robyn and I had put into Coyote Pass, but yet still wanted 25% of it.
And the reason this still matters now is because the story being told today only works if you never stop and ask one question. Why is Meri always framed as unreasonable after the money is already gone? Sit with that. Because if this were really about fairness, we wouldn't be hearing about Meri's demands years after the assets were moved, retitled, spent, leveraged, or locked behind paperwork she never controlled. This isn't about what Meri wanted. It's about what she was never supposed to notice. And that's the part they didn't plan for. Let's establish one thing immediately, because everything else hangs off it.
Because he was legally married to you, he feels he was owed half of what the house was worth.
I have never fought him on that.
Meri was not the financial decision maker in this family. That's not speculation. That's not interpretation. That's been stated repeatedly by Meri herself and by others for years. She trusted the system because she was told the system was family first. She deferred because she believed the people handling the money were acting in good faith. That assumption is the crack everything slipped through. Because when one person defers, another person controls. And when control goes unchecked long enough, it stops feeling borrowed and starts feeling earned. This is how entitlement forms quietly. Now here's where the narrative starts bending reality. You keep hearing that Meri wanted all the money from the Vegas house. That phrase is doing a lot of work. It implies greed. It implies revisionism. It implies that Meri suddenly woke up and decided she deserved more than everyone else. But notice something critical. No one ever explains when she supposedly demanded this, or how, or in what context. That vagueness is intentional, because the moment you add specifics, the accusation collapses. Meri lived in that house, Meri paid the mortgage, Meri maintained the property. Kody did none of that. And no one disputes this. And yet, despite all of that, Meri did not challenge his legal claim. She didn't lawyer up. She didn't stall the sale. She didn't refuse to cooperate. She accepted that his name was on the title. That alone destroys the idea that she was trying to take everything. So why does the accusation persist? Because the accusation isn't meant to describe Meri's behavior. It's meant to justify what happened after. Here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. The divorce decree between Kody and Meri did not divide assets. There was no 50-50th ruling. There was no financial reckoning. There was no judicial determination of fairness. The decree essentially said, nothing to see here. That means everything that followed happened not because a court ordered it, but because trust filled the gap where accountability should have been. And trust is only safe when power is balanced. It wasn't. Kody stayed on the title. Kody stayed on the mortgage. Kody stayed legally entitled, but he did not stay financially involved. That asymmetry matters because asymmetry is where manipulation thrives. Now fast forward, but don't think of this as a timeline. Think of it as a sequence of leverage. The Vegas house sells, and suddenly money that Meri assumed would be hers to decide with is no longer in her hands. It moves quickly, quietly, efficiently, straight into Robyn's house, not partially, not temporarily, not with clear documentation, all of it, every penny. That is not an accident. That is not chaos. That is execution. And here's the psychological trick. By the time Meri realizes what happened, the money is already embedded into another asset, another mortgage, another structure she does not control. At that point, asking for it back doesn't sound like reclaiming what's yours. It sounds like disrupting stability. That framing is powerful. Now ask yourself this. If everyone believed this was fair, why was it never discussed openly? Why was Meri later pressured to stay silent? Why was an NDA even considered? You don't ask for silence when nothing improper occurred. You ask for silence when scrutiny is dangerous. This is where Robyn's role becomes clearer and more disturbing. Robyn's public posture is always moral, always emotional, always framed as concern for others. She speaks in the language of protection, but protection can also be containment. When Robyn positions herself as protecting Meri, she's not advocating for Meri's power. She's defining its limits. Because notice what protection looks like in practice. Meri doesn't get Vegas equity back. Meri doesn't get unrestricted access to Coyote Pass. Meri is asked to accept what she's given. Quietly, Meri is framed as destabilizing if she questions it. That's not protection. That's management. Here's the unsettling part most viewers miss. Robyn did not object when Meri's Vegas money funded her home. She did not insist on repayment. She did not push for clarity. She did not demand documentation. But when it came time to divide remaining assets, suddenly fairness mattered. Suddenly morality mattered. Suddenly legal rights mattered. That inconsistency is the tell. Because people who truly care about fairness care about it consistently, not only when it benefits them. And now we arrive at Coyote Pass. You've been told this was complicated, confusing, a mess of ownership percentages and emotional baggage. But strip away the language and you're left with one simple fact. Coyote Pass was purchased with family money. That matters more than whose name was on which parcel. Because names on paper describe control, not contribution, and contribution is what determines entitlement when fairness is the goal. Meri contributed. That was never disputed until it needed to be. Here's where the pressure increases. The idea of a 25% split did not originate with Meri. It did not originate with Janelle. It originated with Kody when he needed liquidity. That's not speculation. That's documented on the show. When Kody needed money, fairness became flexible. When Robyn's comfort was threatened, fairness became rigid. Watch how fast moral language appears when money might flow away from her instead of toward her. This is why the divorce threat matters, not because Robyn wanted to leave, but because threatening to leave is a way to force alignment. It's leverage. It tells Kody, if you don't protect what benefits me, you lose what you fear losing most. And it worked, because suddenly Kody's language shifts. He begins questioning the very agreement he proposed. He begins implying Meri was unreasonable. He begins softening Robyn's position while hardening his stance against Meri. That's not a coincidence. That's compliance. By the end of this story, Meri is framed as difficult, emotional, and demanding. But ask yourself something uncomfortable. Why does Meri only become a problem after she starts asking and questions?
Never fought him on that.
Oh.
And so when I got the email back, him like literally just in the past week or so saying that I demanded the full amount of the equity. I mean, sure, it would make sense that I would get it.
Why does her supposed greed only surface after the assets are no longer accessible? Why does fairness get invoked only when it's time to give her less? Not when she gave everything. Those are not narrative accidents. They are defense mechanisms. And here's the quiet truth that reframes everything. This was never about dividing assets. It was about preventing reversal. Once money is moved, once titles are changed, once silence is secured, the risk isn't fairness. The risk is exposure. And that's where this story is actually headed. Because the moment Meri stops playing the role she was assigned, the compliant, trusting, grateful participant, the entire structure starts to look fragile. And fragile structures don't need enemies. They collapse under inspection. Family. Money sounds warm, cooperative, shared risk, shared reward. But in this family, that phrase quietly evolved into something else. It stopped meaning everyone contributes. It started meaning some people give, others decide. And that shift didn't happen loudly. It happened gradually, through habit, through Trust through repetition until questioning it felt disruptive instead of reasonable. Here's the critical thing you need to understand going into this part. Money doesn't disappear in this family. It changes classification, and whoever controls the classification controls the story. At first, family money functioned like a pool, income from the show, equity from homes, contributions from individual wives. It all went in together, and decisions were made collectively, or at least presented that way. But presentation and reality are not the same thing, because once Robyn entered the picture, something subtle began to change. The money didn't stop being pulled, but access to decision-making narrowed, and when access narrows, transparency follows. This is not about Robyn being evil or strategic in some cartoonish way. It's about incentive structures. Robyn entered a family where the system already existed. She didn't invent it. She learned how to use it, and she learned quickly. The key psychological pivot happens when pooled money starts funding individual security, not family-wide stability, not shared infrastructure, individual housing. Once family money was used to secure Robyn's living situation, repeatedly, the pool stopped being neutral. It became directional. Money flowed toward Robyn's needs, not around them. And here's where Meri's role becomes essential. Meri's income was reliable. Meri didn't have dependent children draining resources. Meri was emotionally invested in the family's long-term survival. That makes her the perfect contributor. Low demand, high output, high trust. Those are the people systems quietly exploit. First, now let's talk about classification, because this is where the manipulation becomes nearly invisible. When Meri's Vegas equity was used for Robyn's house, it wasn't framed as theft. It wasn't framed as appropriation. It was framed as family helping family. That framing matters because once money is labeled family money, individual claims become morally suspect. You're not asking for your money back. You're taking from the family. That's a powerful deterrent. And Meri, who already struggled with belonging, was never going to be the person who shattered that illusion. So she consented quietly. But notice what happens later. When it's time to divide Coyote Pass, suddenly classification flips. Now we hear Robyn and Kody put more into it. Meri didn't recognize their contribution. Ownership percentages matter now. The pool is no longer the pool. Now money is individual again. And that inconsistency is not a mistake. It's the strategy. Money is collective when it benefits Robyn. Money is individual when it benefits Robyn. That's the pattern. Here's something most viewers don't clock the first time. Meri was not on the loans for Coyote Pass. That alone should raise questions. If this was truly family money, why wasn't everyone equally obligated? Why was risk unevenly distributed? Because obligation creates leverage. And Meri didn't have leverage, she had trust. She paid into something she wasn't legally bound to, believing contribution would translate into equity later. That belief only holds if good faith exists. On both sides, it didn't. This is where Janelle becomes important, not as a hero, but as a contrast. Janelle understood the books. She understood structure. She understood risk. That's why Janelle eventually became vocal. Meri didn't, not because she didn't care, but because she didn't understand the implications until it was too late. That difference matters. Because systems often collapse not when everyone wakes up, but when the last trusting person does. And Meri was that person. Now let's slow this down, because something crucial happens here. When Meri later describes the Vegas money as a loan, it's not revisionist history. It's her trying to reassert classification. She's saying, this wasn't a gift. This wasn't communal. This had expectations attached, and the reaction to that reframing is telling. There's immediate discomfort, immediate defensiveness, immediate urgency to shut it down. Because if it's a loan, then there should be repayment, there should be documentation, there should be disclosure, and suddenly, what felt like family cooperation starts looking like financial misrepresentation. That's why silence becomes important. This is also why the NDA conversation matters more than people think. You don't need NDA letters in healthy families. You need them when stories can unravel protections. An NDA isn't about peace. It's about containment and who benefits. Most from containment here. Not Meri. Let's talk about Robyn's hold harmless posture, because this is one of the most psychologically revealing aspects of the entire situation. When Robyn resists Meri receiving 25% of Coyote Pass, she's not just protecting her share, she is protecting Precedent. Because if Meri is acknowledged as being owed something, anything, it opens the door to questions about everything else. The Vegas equity, the loan framing, the source of funds, a single concession can unravel years of quiet advantage. That's why the resistance is so intense. Now pay attention to Robyn's language during this period. She speaks about morality, about fairness, about ethics. But notice what's missing. She never says, let's sit down with an accountant. She never says, let's trace contributions. She never says, let's formalize repayment. Because objective clarity is dangerous when subjective narratives are working. Just fine. Morality without math is a shield. This is where the divorce threat becomes less emotional and more strategic. Threatening to leave isn't about ending a relationship. It's about forcing alignment. It's saying, your loyalty must flow in one direction, and Kody responds accordingly. He doesn't say, let's clarify this fairly. He says, Meri is being unreasonable. That shift is not organic. It's adaptive. Here's the part that should linger with you. If Meri had walked away earlier, like Christine, none of this would have happened. If you listen to Kody closely, not to what he says, but how he says it, you can hear the pressure. His story doesn't evolve, it reacts. And that distinction matters, because people who are telling the truth usually refine details. People who are protecting something change their position. That's what you're watching with Kody. At first, Kody speaks with certainty. He talks about fairness. He talks about equal splits. He talks about wanting resolution. Then something shifts. Suddenly, he's unsure. Suddenly, he's questioning what people deserve. Suddenly, the agreement he proposed feels negotiable. That's not confusing. That's recalibration under threat. Here's the key insight most viewers miss. Kody doesn't change his story when he gains new information. He changes it when someone else applies pressure. And the timing of those shifts is everything. When Kody floated the idea of a 25% split, he did it casually, almost pragmatically. Why? Because at that moment, fairness served him. He needed liquidity. He needed flexibility. He needed money to move. And when fairness aligns with need, it's easy to sound principled. But once Robyn resists, once Robyn reframes the situation as unfair to her, Kody's tone hardens. Now he's not talking about resolution. He's talking about entitlement. Now Meri isn't owed, she's demanding. That reframing is defensive, not logical. Watch how Kody positions himself when conflict intensifies. He rarely says, I decided. Instead, he says, I felt like it didn't seem fair. I don't think she recognizes. Those are not statements of fact. They're emotional disclaimers. They allow him to shift responsibility without admitting change. And that's important. Because admitting change would mean admitting influence. Here's where it gets psychologically revealing. Kody consistently aligns his moral stance with the person whose approval he fears losing. Early on, that fear was distributed across the family. Later, it wasn't. Once Robyn becomes the emotional center of gravity, Kody's ethics orbit her. Comfort. That's not love. That's dependency. Now let's talk about contradiction. Because contradiction is where truth leaks out. Kody claims Meri didn't acknowledge how much he and Robyn put into Coyote Pass. But earlier, he openly stated that Coyote Pass was paid for with family money. Both cannot be true. Either contributions were communal, or they were individual. And unequal the moment he toggles between those explanations, he exposes motive. He uses whichever framing protects the outcome he needs in that moment. That's not accounting. That's narrative control. Here's another contradiction that matters. Kody insists Meri wanted all the equity from the Vegas house, but in the same breath, he acknowledges he was legally entitled to half, and that Meri didn't fight him on it. Those statements cancel each other out. If Meri didn't fight him, she wasn't demanding everything. So why keep saying it? Because repetition creates truth by familiarity, not accuracy. Say something often enough, and people stop interrogating it. Now pay attention to how Kody talks about Meri's understanding of finances. He subtly emphasizes her lack of involvement. He reminds the audience she wasn't managing the books. That sounds neutral, even factual, until you realize what it accomplishes. It casts Meri as uninformed, and uninformed people are easier to discredit. Because if she didn't understand the finances then, why trust her interpretation now? That framing insulates Kody from scrutiny. But here's the catch. If Meri truly didn't understand the finances, and Kody knew that, then he had more responsibility, not less. Power over information creates duty. Instead, it was used as cover. And that's where moral language becomes camouflage. Let's slow down here, because this is critical. Kody often claims he was trying to do the moral thing, but morality without transparency is meaningless. If morality mattered, there would be clear documentation, open accounting, equal disclosure. None of that happened. Instead, there were conversations behind closed doors, shifting explanations, and pressure applied selectively. That's not moral action. That's damage control. Now think about why Kody brings up Meri's supposed demand now. Not during the sale, not during the transfer, not during the decision-making, after. That timing is defensive. It reframes past actions as justified reactions rather than premeditated decisions. It's saying, we didn't take, we responded. And that's a crucial distinction when accountability is looming. This is also why Kody slips when he talks about percentages. He can't keep the math straight, not because it's complex, but because the numbers aren't the point. The point is outcome preservation. And when outcomes are threatened, precision disappears. You'll notice he avoids concrete dollar amounts, he avoids dates, he avoids written agreements. He stays in the realm of feeling. Feeling flexible. Paper is not. Here's the psychological tell that matters most. When Kody feels secure, he speaks generously. When he feels cornered, he speaks restrictively. That tells you everything about where his values come from. They don't originate internally. They adapt externally. Now let's talk about the moment Robyn threatens divorce, because this is where Kody's contradictions accelerate. The threat itself isn't the point. The effect is, immediately after, Kody becomes less willing to challenge Robyn, less willing to defend prior agreements, less willing to advocate for Meri. That's not a coincidence. That's fear-driven. Alignment. Fear does strange things to people. It makes them minimize risk rather than maximize fairness. And for Kody, the greatest risk is not financial. It's emotional abandonment. So when forced to choose between upholding an agreement that benefits Meri or preserving his bond with Robyn, he chooses Robyn every time, and then builds a story to live with that choice. This is why his explanations feel hollow, because they're constructed after the decision, not before. They're justifications, not principles. And that's why they don't hold up under scrutiny. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Kody isn't the mastermind here. He's the facilitator. The system didn't require him to be brilliant, only compliant. Robyn applies pressure. Kody absorbs it. Meri pays the cost. That triangle repeats, and this is why Kody's language matters more than his actions, because language reveals allegiance. And Kody's allegiance has been clear for a long time. Even when he insists otherwise, by the time Meri starts asserting herself, Kody has already repositioned her as the antagonist. That move is necessary, because if Meri is reasonable, then Kody is culpable, and culpability is exactly what he's trying to avoid. So when you hear Kody say, she wanted all the money, understand what he's really saying. He's not describing Meri, he's defending himself. Christine exited with clarity. Titles were clean. Assets were clearly separated. Meri stayed. And staying allowed her contributions to be absorbed rather than settled. Staying blurred the line between generosity and obligation. That's why Meri's exit looks messy, not because she's difficult, but because she waited too long to demand clarity. And systems rarely reward late awakenings. By the time Meri starts asking questions, the narrative is already prepared. She's emotional, she's confused, she's rewriting history. That framing inoculates everyone else against scrutiny, Because if Meri is unstable, then her claims are suspect. And once her claims are suspect, the money stays put. This is the quiet tragedy of this story. Meri didn't lose because she was greedy. She lost because she believed shared values would eventually protect her interests. They didn't. Values were performative, incentives were real, and incentives always win. What you're watching now isn't just fallout, it's narrative maintenance. Every time someone insists this was complicated, they're avoiding the simpler truth. The money flowed one way, the explanations flowed another, and the person who trusted the longest paid the highest price. Robyn doesn't argue with facts, she argues with morality. And that distinction matters because morality is subjective, emotional, and nearly impossible to disprove in real time. Facts can be audited. Morality can be performed. That's the space Robyn operates in. When Robyn says she's trying to do the right thing, she's not making a claim about fairness, she's making a claim about character. She's positioning herself as ethically superior. And once that position is established, anyone who disagrees with her is no longer just wrong, they're immoral. That framing is incredibly effective because it shifts the argument away from numbers and toward intent. And intent is where Robyn feels safest. Notice when Robyn's moral language activates. It doesn't appear during spending. It doesn't appear during asset transfers. It doesn't appear when money flows toward her. It appears when money might flow away from her. That timing is not accidental. Morality becomes visible only when power is at risk. Robyn frames herself as Meri's protector. She implies Meri is vulnerable, confused, at risk of being taken advantage of. That sounds compassionate until you look at the outcomes, because protection that results in less autonomy is not protection, it's containment. Here's the subtle psychological maneuver Robyn uses repeatedly. She infantilizes Meri without sounding condescending. She speaks as though Meri cannot fully grasp the situation, as though someone needs to intervene for her own good. That framing accomplishes two things at once. It removes Meri's agency, it justifies overriding her interests, and because it's framed as concern, it rarely gets challenged. Now let's talk about the divorce threat, not emotionally, but structurally. Threatening divorce isn't about ending a marriage, it's about activating fear. And Robyn knows exactly which fear to activate. Kody's deepest anxiety isn't losing money, it's losing attachment. So when Robyn implies she might leave, she's not negotiating, she's enforcing alignment. That threat doesn't need to be carried out. It just needs to be believed. And Kody believes it. Here's what's revealing. Robyn threatens divorce in the name of morality. She frames it as standing up for what's right. But morality that requires coercion isn't morality. It's leverage dressed up as virtue. Now pay attention to Robyn's behavior during the Coyote Pass negotiations. She doesn't propose alternative solutions. She doesn't offer concessions. She doesn't suggest mediation. She resists. She delays. She withholds agreement. That's not someone seeking fairness. That's someone protecting a position. And yet, publicly, she maintains the posture of reluctance. She's always just about to give in, just struggling. With ethics, just torn. This indecision is performative because while she appears conflicted, the outcome remains unchanged. Time passes, pressure increases, others compromise, she doesn't. This is where the NDA attempt becomes critical. An NDA is not a neutral tool. It is a preemptive defense. It says, whatever happened here cannot withstand public scrutiny. And if Robyn truly believed she had acted ethically, she wouldn't need one. Ethics don't require silence. Exposure only threatens behavior that can't survive daylight. Now let's talk about Robyn's spending, because it contextualizes everything else. While disputes over Meri's entitlement are framed as financially precarious, Robyn continues discretionary spending without restraint. That contradiction matters. It tells you this is not about scarcity. It's about priority. And Meri is not a priority. Here's the part viewers often resist acknowledging. Robyn doesn't see Meri as an equal stakeholder. She sees her as a resource that has already been extracted. From that perspective, Meri asking for more isn't fair, it's disruptive. It threatens a settled advantage. This is why Robyn's morality language feels hollow under scrutiny. It's not applied universally. It's applied selectively to justify keeping what's already been taken. Now let's examine how Robyn talks about Kody during this period. She positions him as morally compromised, as failing to do the right thing, as someone she may need to oppose. That framing serves two purposes. It distances her from responsibility. It pressures Kody to correct course her way if the outcome benefits her. Kody was wrong to hesitate if the outcome benefits her. She is the moral compass. That's not a partnership. That's dominance. And here's the quietest, most telling detail. Robyn never acknowledges Meri's sacrifice. Not publicly, not emotionally, not financially. There's no gratitude, no recognition, no accountability. Because acknowledging sacrifice creates obligation, and obligation undermines entitlement. By the time Robyn frames herself as the moral actor, the groundwork is already laid. Meri is positioned as confused. Kody is positioned as conflicted. Robyn is positioned as righteous. That triad is stable, and stability, once achieved, is fiercely protected. The problem is that moral narratives don't age well. They require constant reinforcement. And every time Robyn repeats hers, the cracks widen. Because morality that shifts with self-interest eventually exposes itself. Here's the truth most people don't want to say out loud. Robyn didn't protect Meri. She protected the outcome. And the outcome was already in her favor. Once you see that, her behavior stops looking complicated. It looks strategic. And strategy doesn't require malice. It only requires incentive. Silence is often framed as maturity, as restraint, as choosing peace, but in power dynamics, silence is rarely about peace. It's about risk management. And in this situation, silence wasn't encouraged because talking would cause pain. It was encouraged because talking would cause exposure. The suggestion of an NDA is the clearest signal you get that this story cannot survive full transparency. NDA letters don't exist to protect feelings. They exist to protect positions. They lock narratives in place. And once silence is contractual, the past becomes untouchable. Ask yourself why silence was necessary after the money moved, not before. No one asked for an NDA when Meri's Vegas equity was redirected. No one asked for confidentiality when loans weren't clarified. No one asked for quiet while titles stayed uneven. Silence only became urgent once Meri started naming specifics. That timing is not subtle. Here's what an NDA would have accomplished. It would have prevented Meri from describing the Vegas money as a loan, questioning how Coyote Pass was funded, clarifying who benefited, and how reframing the story publicly. In other words, it would have frozen the narrative at the moment most favorable to Robyn and Kody. That's not coincidence. That's containment. Now think about the psychological pressure embedded in asking for silence. It's not just legal. It's emotional. Signing an NDA would mean Meri agreeing implicitly that her truth is dangerous, that her perspective is something that needs to be hidden. That alone can silence someone without a signature Meri didn't sign. And that refusal matters more than anything else she's said, because refusing silence is the first act of reclaiming agency. Here's the part that should unsettle you. If nothing improper happened, silence would be unnecessary. If everything was fair, documentation would protect everyone. But documentation does the opposite here. It creates traceability, and traceability threatens people who benefited disproportionately. Silence also serves another purpose. It buys time. Time allows narratives to harden, memories to blur, audiences move on. By the time questions resurface, fatigue has set in. That's the hope. This is why Robyn's repeated emphasis on not talking about it is so revealing. She frames silence as self-sacrifice, as emotional labor, as restraint for the family's sake. But restraint that only flows one direction is not mutual. Meri was asked to stay quiet. Kody was allowed to speak. Robyn was allowed to frame. That asymmetry is intentional. Now consider how silence shapes public perception. When only one version circulates, it becomes the default truth. Meri's absence from the conversation didn't mean she agreed. It meant she was outpaced. And once a narrative gains momentum, Contradicting it feels like disruption. That's a powerful deterrent. Silence also allows plausible deniability. Without statements on record, intent remains ambiguous, responsibility stays diffuse, accountability is delayed. That's advantageous to people who want outcomes without ownership. Here's something most viewers overlook. Silence is expensive. It costs the person who stays quiet far more than the person who speaks. Meri paid with reputation, with credibility, with leverage. Others paid nothing. That imbalance tells you who silence was protecting. And now, as cracks begin to show, the reaction isn't reflection. It's escalation. Defensiveness increases. Justifications multiply. Contradictions appear. Those are not signs of innocence. They're signs of stress. Stress emerges when a system realizes its protections are weakening, when silence is no longer guaranteed, when questions gain traction, when viewers begin connecting dots. That's when narratives become louder, not clearer. This is why silence becomes the central battleground, not money, not percentages, not even property, control of the story. Because once the story is reclaimed, everything else follows. Meri refusing the NDA wasn't just a legal choice. It was a psychological pivot. It said, I will not carry the cost of your comfort anymore. And that's when the tone shifts. That's when she becomes difficult, confusing, demanding. Those labels exist to reassert control. But here's the thing about silence. Once it's broken, it can't be restored. And once people start listening for what wasn't said, the entire story sounds different. What comes next is not about resolution. It's about reckoning. Because when silence fails, systems either reform or collapse. Meri's greatest mistake wasn't trust. It was timing. She didn't wake up when the system was forming. She didn't wake up when the money first shifted. She didn't wake up when control quietly consolidated. She woke up after the structure was already built. And in systems like this, late awareness is treated as rebellion. There's a reason Meri is framed as unstable instead of wronged. People who wake up early are listened to. People who wake up late are discredited. Because late awakenings threaten settled outcomes. By the time Meri starts asserting herself, everyone else has already adapted to the imbalance. Robyn is secure. Kody is aligned. Janelle is detached. Christine is gone. The system no longer needs Meri's cooperation, so when she finally speaks up, she's not seen as a stakeholder. She's seen as a liability. This is why her concerns are dismissed as emotional rather than examined as factual. Emotion is easier to undermine than evidence. And Meri, after years of being minimized, expresses frustration imperfectly. That imperfection becomes the excuse. Here's the psychological trap Meri fell into. She believed that longevity equaled protection, that staying meant security, that loyalty would eventually be rewarded, that fairness would surface once emotions cooled. But systems don't self-correct. They entrench, and by the time Meri realizes the imbalance, the rules have already changed. Now pay attention to how her awakening is portrayed, not as clarity, not as growth, but as confusion. She's framed as suddenly misunderstanding things she agreed to. That language subtly rewrites consent. It implies she was always informed, and now she's just changing her mind. That's powerful misdirection, because informed consent requires information, and Meri never had full access. She didn't manage the books. She didn't structure the loans. She didn't control the titles. She trusted. And trust without transparency is vulnerability. This is where the dynamic becomes particularly cruel. Meri is criticized for not understanding finances earlier, but the very people criticizing her benefited from that lack of understanding. That's not coincidence. That's exploitation framed as incompetence. Here's something uncomfortable. If Meri had demanded clarity earlier, she would have been labeled difficult sooner. The only difference is that the cost would have been lowered by waiting. She increased the cost, and therefore the resistance. People don't resist fairness. They resist reversal. Once Robyn's house was purchased, once equity was absorbed, once titles were settled, and doing anything became threatening. So Meri's questions weren't just inconvenient, they were dangerous. This is why the pushback intensifies the moment Meri starts naming specifics. dates, amounts, intent, specificity is lethal to vague narratives, and vague narratives are all that's holding this one together. Notice how quickly the conversation shifts when Meri becomes precise. Suddenly, it's about her tone, her attitude, her emotional state, never the substance. That's a classic deflection. Now think about why Meri didn't follow Christine's path. Christine left cleanly because she exited early, before assets were interwoven beyond repair, before silence was demanded, before narratives hardened. Meri stayed, and staying meant her contributions were continuously reabsorbed. By the time she left emotionally, she had already given materially. This is why Meri's situation looks messier, not because she's messier, because she stayed long enough to be depleted. There's also a deeper psychological layer here. Meri was emotionally isolated long before she was financially sidelined. Isolation weakens negotiation. When you're cut off relationally, you hesitate to assert materially because you're already afraid of losing what little connection remains. That fear was leveraged. And when Meri finally stopped prioritizing connection over self-preservation, the reaction was swift. She became the problem because systems don't tolerate people who stop playing their role. Here's the quiet truth. Meri didn't change. Her position did. She went from useful to inconvenient. And inconvenient people are reframed. That reframing is why viewers are encouraged to see her claims as revisionist. It preserves the idea that everything was fine until she disrupted it. But nothing was fine. It was just unchallenged. This is the danger of waking up late. You're not rewarded for clarity. You're punished for threatening stability. And yet, late awakenings have one advantage. They happen after patterns are visible. Meri didn't just question one decision, she questioned the entire structure. That's far more dangerous, because once you see the structure, you can't unsee it, and once viewers see it, the story changes. Christine didn't just leave the marriage, she left the system, and once someone exits cleanly, it exposes everything the system relies on to function. Christine's departure was simple, clean title. Clear equity, defined boundaries, no ambiguity, no shared obligations, no silence required. That simplicity is what made it dangerous. Up until that point, the family narrative depended on endurance. Staying was framed as virtue, leaving was framed as failure. Christine inverted that. She left and didn't collapse. That alone destabilized the moral hierarchy. Here's why Christine's exit mattered more than anyone admits. She demonstrated that clarity was possible, not eventually, not after years of negotiation, immediately. And once that option exists, everyone else's situation becomes questionable. Christine's equity was respected because Kody signed off. Why? Because Robyn wanted him off the title. That detail matters. It shows that clean breaks were never impossible. They were selectively granted. Christine's departure set a precedent. It proved assets can be separated cleanly, titles can be adjusted, equity can be honored. So when Meri didn't receive the same treatment, the inconsistency became visible. That's when the story had to change. Now the narrative shifts. Christine is framed as independent, strong, decisive. Meri is framed as confused, emotional, demanding. Same system, different outcomes. That contrast is not about personality. It's about timing and threat level. Christine left before her contributions were fully absorbed. Meri stayed until hers were. That difference determined everything. After Christine leaves, urgency increases. Coyote Pass becomes more pressing. Money becomes more contested. Narratives become sharper. Why? Because the system has lost one pillar of legitimacy. Christine's exit also changes Kody's behavior. He becomes more defensive, more rigid, more reactive. Not because he lost love, because he lost control. Once Christine proves that leaving doesn't equal ruin, the fear-based containment weakens. Now Meri's questions aren't theoretical. They're actionable. And action is the last thing the system wants. This is when Robyn's posture hardens. Her resistance intensifies. Her moral framing escalates. Her threat threshold lowers. Because the risk is no longer hypothetical. Christine's clean exit highlights how messy Meri's situation is and forces viewers to ask why. And once that question is asked, The entire structure feels unstable. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Christine was allowed to leave with dignity because her departure didn't threaten past decisions. Meri's clarity does, because Meri's clarity points backward at money already spent, at equity already absorbed, at stories already told. That's why it's resisted. Christine's exit also exposed the lie that fairness was impossible. It wasn't impossible. It was optional, and options only get exercised when power allows it. Once Christine leaves, the system shifts from maintenance to defense. The goal is no longer harmony. It's containment. This is why everything accelerates. After Christine's departure, agreements are revisited, positions harden, silence is demanded, the illusion of family first cracks, and once it cracks, everything underneath becomes visible. Christine leaving didn't cause the breakdown. It revealed it, and now Meri's situation can no longer be dismissed as isolated. It's part of a pattern, one where those who stay longest lose the most. That realization is what destabilizes everything, because it reframes loyalty not as virtue, but as risk. This story only looks like family drama if you keep watching it emotionally. The moment you watch it structurally, it becomes something else entirely. What you've been seeing isn't a marriage falling apart. It's a system losing control of its narrative. And systems don't collapse when people leave. They collapse when people stop being quiet. Everything that happened after Meri refused silence was inevitable. The defensiveness, the contradictions, the moral grandstanding, those aren't reactions to betrayal. They're reactions to exposure. Here's the truth this show never says out loud. This family didn't fall apart because love disappeared. It fell apart because accountability arrived. And accountability is fatal to systems built on imbalance. For years, the structure worked because each person played a role. Christine provided emotional labor. Janelle provided financial labor. Meri provided material support and loyalty. Kody provided authority. Robyn provided justification. That ecosystem was stable, not fair. Stability is not the same as justice. The moment Christine exited, stability weakened. The moment Meri asked questions, justice entered. And justice doesn't negotiate quietly. This is why the final narrative tries so hard to frame Meri as the problem. Because if Meri is reasonable, then the system is indefensible. And if the system is indefensible, then the people who benefited must answer for it. That's the real fear. Notice what never actually gets resolved. No clear accounting, no shared ledger, no documented reconciliation, just stories. Stories told louder and louder. Because stories are easier to control than numbers. The repeated insistence that this was complicated is not explanation. It's camouflage. Complication is useful when simplicity would expose intent. And the simple truth is this: money flowed toward power, silence protected it, morality justified it, fear enforced it. Once you understand that, the emotional beats stop being confusing. Kody's contradictions stop being mysterious. Robyn's righteousness stops being convincing. Meri's frustration stops being dramatic. It all aligns. This isn't about whether Meri deserved more. It's about why asking that question felt threatening. Fair systems don't fear questions. They welcome them. What you're watching now is not closure. It's a system attempting to finalize its version of history before it loses control of it completely. Because once viewers see the pattern, the illusion can't be restored. And here's the most important takeaway. This didn't happen because Meri trusted too much. It happened because others counted on that trust. That distinction matters because it shifts responsibility where it belongs. Sister Wives didn't expose a broken family. It exposed a familiar structure, one where loyalty is praised, sacrifice is expected, silence is rewarded, and those who benefit most insist they're the most moral. Once silence breaks, these systems always do the same thing. They minimize, they deflect, they rewrite, they isolate. But they can't unring the bell. You weren't meant to notice this. You were meant to watch emotionally and move on. The moment you watch analytically, the story changes forever. And now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it. That's why this matters. Because this story isn't rare. It's recognizable. And that's what makes it uncomfortable.